Evolution is all about unity, diversity, and modularity. And Devo has kind of informed evolutionary biologists and biologists about these three big concepts in a lot of important ways. Unity just refers to this fact that all life on Earth is descended from some primordial life form, and Darwin recognized that. And in the past decades, we've kind of filled that in with some really profound new data that the genomes of even very different organisms have a lot of core similarities. Like the main genes in those genomes are basically the same. You have this core set of genes that are conserved across all organisms. And that was stunning to see, and it was stunning proof of this unity. As far as Devo and developmental biology, another layer of this unity is that when you look at how these genes work together during development to make something. So, and development is basically the process by which you take these A, T, C's, and G's of DNA and turn that into a real living form, right? And what I mean by unity of development is how these genes work together to produce a certain outcome as for a developmental outcome. So, a nice example of that, a classic Devo example, is a kind of the cassette of genes that work together to make a photoreceptor in an eye. It was discovered, 20 or 30 years ago, that the same core set of genes makes, the main cell of eyes, photoreceptors in a fruit fly and a mouse and a human across all animals. So that's another, not only are the genes the same, but most of the times during development, the genes work together in a very similar way. So it's another layer of unity. The flip side of unity is diversity. And this kind of contrast and conflict between diversity and unity is like a big question in Devo. And Devo has really shed light on how you can have this insane amount of sameness across organisms while still having different organisms, right? So how do you have animals as different as a fruit fly and a person and a worm and a shark with all the same genes? You can have diversity because you take these same parts and put them together in different ways at different times and different amounts. I kind of think of it as a Lego set. So the sameness, across, the living organisms on the planet are these genes. These are kind of like Lego pieces. And you can also think of how the genes interact as, as their own little cassettes too. But you can just think, okay, organisms have basically the same pieces, but they're not the same because how they put these pieces together is different from organism to organism. So you have kind of the same set of pieces, but the instructions on how you stick them together and what you make from those pieces is different. And that's kind of how Devo has helped us think about animal diversity. So again, if you go back to the example of the eye, you have this sameness of the main kind of genetic cassette that makes a photoreceptor, right, in a fly or a human or any kind of earthworm you might dig up. And it has the same cassette for making a photoreceptor, but eyes are very different across the animal kingdom, right? A fly eye looks very different from our eye, and our eye, looks very different from, an eagle's eye works differently. So, you have this sameness, but how you put the parts together is different. And that's kind of the source of diversity, and how we understand animal diversity has really been, animal and plant diversity has really been informed by Devo and how Devo has told us, how development actually works. Devo has really made a huge contribution in our understanding of developmental modularity. So modularity is kind of a catch-all phrase for a lot of different aspects of biology. As far as Devo and developmental biology, a module kind of refers to a packet of genes that work together to give a certain outcome. Developmental biologist thinks of groups of genes working together as modules. So what would that look like? Again, if you go back to the example of an eye, there's a certain set of genes, dozens of genes, that work together in a certain way in all organisms to create a photoreceptor cell. A cell that can detect light and gives an electrical output as a result. So you have this set of genes that work together in the same way in all organisms. That would be a developmental module, this group of genes that give a certain developmental or morphological output. Now, Devo has shown that not only do different animals have the same basic set of genes, but that these genes work together similarly in these packets, these developmental modules, often called like gene regulatory networks, to give certain developmental outputs. Understanding that those modules exist and understanding how they work has really helped us understand how you can have relatively big changes, evolutionary changes in animal and plant form fairly quickly. So these modules are usually controlled by a fairly small number. I mean, the modules themselves consist of dozens of genes, but what switches on the modules, these big cassettes, there's usually only a few developmental regulators, dozen, half dozen of these developmental regulators that activate this big module. So to make an eye, you really only have to change how a couple of genes are used to put a photoreceptor in a new location in an organism.